All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we discuss cybersecurity considerations for plan sponsors. My name is Matt Peterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Government Defined Contribution Administrators, or NAGDCA. We represent state and local government DC plan sponsors and their private sector partners. Cybersecurity is a topic that we cover often at NAGDCA, and now, as many of our members have moved to working remotely for the first time and attacks are increasing, it is more important than ever. When we look for current information on cybersecurity issues, we often turn to SPARC as the representative of the record-keeping community, and specifically their Data Security Oversight Board, a group that comprises many NAGDCA members and is solely focused on cybersecurity. The Data Security Oversight Board has set the standard in the industry for good cybersecurity practices, and today we are very excited to partner with SPARC and also DCIIA, who was kind enough to host today's webinar, to provide all of our members with a webinar that we hope will both be thought-provoking and informative. So I want to welcome members from all three organizations today. Thank you for attending. Our intent with this webinar is not to scare you, though unfortunately that happens somewhat with cybersecurity issues, but instead we want to provide our plan sponsors with practical information you can use to protect yourself and your participants in this highly unusual environment. Before we kick it off, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda from DCIIA to run through some housekeeping items. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you. So all our participants are muted throughout, but we encourage you to please ask questions. You can do that by submitting through the question tab on your control panel. And at the end of our webinar, please complete the brief survey that will pop up on your screen. It'll take you no more than 2 minutes, and your feedback really helps us improve our webinars. And also, our replay of this webinar will be available on all three of the member organizations' websites after today.
Thank you, Matt and Amanda. This is Wendy Carter, the moderator for this panel. Hello to everyone, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on your time zone. As I said, I'm Wendy Young Carter, and I am the Defined Contribution Director for Siegel Consulting. For all of us, actually, not only those that are attending this call, we're all now operating in what some people have been calling business as unusual environment. And I think that truer words have probably never been spoken. I've been a DC plan consultant for many years, and the industry has changed dramatically. I remember the days when no one blinked twice when there was a DC plan fund lineup with 30 to 40 funds. But one of the most noteworthy changes that time has evolved and where we have been gone and it improved is the evolution of DC record keeping and participant services. We started with brochures and paper enrollment, and then we now have transactional websites. We went from generic and rudimentary retirement account balance projections to retirement income modeling tools and personal financial tools and resources, something that seems almost prescient right now in terms of our financial crisis that we're confronting. Speaking of which, we can't read your minds, so we here at this panel would like to do some polling questions so that we can get a little bit of a sense of those that are listening into the call. And as you'll see, these are the what category best represents your organization. And I know it just takes a moment for people's results to get compiled, but I do think it's important to get an idea of the complexion of the attendees and also to make sure that we address the different challenges that each type of organization has. Looks like we should be getting our results back shortly. Okay. All righty. As I think you all can see on your screen, it looks like we have 26% from the public sector or the government segment, almost 60% from private industry. Nonprofit, we've got about 6% and about 10% in others. So I think this really gives us a good idea of the type of information we should be sharing and we'll also be able to, identify questions and responses that apply to your industry. So thank you very much for that. And we do have another quick presentation polling question. All right. The question is, do you have a secured VPN for employees working remotely? And I think that's really always makes me think of a saying that my father always had, which is hope for the best and plan for the worst. So while we're waiting for the results here, Brian, could you speak to the security considerations of working from home? And what would you recommend to sponsors and participants?
Yes, happy to speak to that, Wendy. I think there are a few very important recommendations to consider. I think there's so many aspects, right? How do you secure and protect your business? How do you secure and protect your computer, your video teleconferencing sessions? I do think that there's a few key things. Number one is just the current threat environment. To be aware of the COVID-related fraud and phishing, to be extra vigilant as cyber criminals and fraudsters are taking advantage of current news events to custom create these fraud and phishing campaigns, right? So just a few things to be very mindful and particularly diligent about. I would say any email purporting to come from the World Health Organization, the Center for Disease Control, Johns Hopkins University, as many people are aware of and are using their interactive map that can detail infections down to a county level. Anything purporting to come from Zoom or BlueJeans or WebEx or Google Classroom, right? Everyone's using these new video conferencing technologies, and the fraudsters are taking advantage of that. The CARES Act, right? The CARES Act is another big one, right? Don't click on emails that are asking you to click here to find out whether or not your stimulus check has been deposited. And certainly Office 365 and OneDrive password reset emails, that's another very common theme because most people, either corporate and or personal users, many people are just using Office 365 and or OneDrive. And so be aware of those kinds of things, right? Reputable institutions are never going to ask you to provide personally identifiable information within the body of an email. Second, I think it's really important to avoid use of personal devices, personal social media, and personal email for work, right? Use only corporate or government-owned devices. And it's refreshing to see the results of the secured VPN, just because that's so key, right? If you have a work-issued device, you really want to make sure that you're using that particular device. If you don't have a work device, and if you're forced to use a personal device, try your best to make it a dedicated device to where no other family members are using it. Make sure that you've got personal firewall software, antivirus software, etc., installed on that personal device. And again, if at all possible, make sure that you're the only person that's using it. It's a dedicated device. You're not using it for, casually surfing the internet. Your kids, your teens aren't on it. And finally, I would say implement some simple and secure teleconferencing options so that you're using this new way of communicating, right? Whether it's through Zoom or WebEx or Google Classroom, BlueJeans, etc., you're doing so in secure fashion. I think Dennis is going to address that here shortly.
Great, thank you, Brian. In terms of other questions, David, would you be able to comment about the talk in the past year about the privacy of participant data that we're hearing a lot about, and what that means for the attendees benefit program?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that something really to keep in mind right at this moment is we've been hearing so much talk about how do you protect data, how do you limit its use, but yet at the same time, we're hearing right now about Google and Apple, and probably Amazon too eventually, rolled out their own improvements to their operating software at this point. And those changes to their OS are going to design to help for tracking. They've said they're going to reverse, at least Apple has, after everything has gone through with the coronavirus, the ability to track. And I think we're going to see some of that. So the question that comes to mind immediately for folks right now is, well, are we relaxing things? Can we do things more flexibly? And the answer is the data privacy and security rules still apply. For instance, in California, there's a whole debate about how the California Consumer Privacy Act applies in the land of ERISA benefit plans. We don't need to get there today. But the key takeaway to keep in mind is the rules still apply. There is some relaxation. What you need to be thinking about, and I know we'll get into this more as we go forward, is also how do you deal with things that are a challenge now, such as notarization or other approaches, or validation where you would normally have looked at a driver's license. How do you deal with that? That's the key thing. And just keep in mind, the plaintiffs' lawyers, and we can talk more later, have not forgotten our world. They're still bringing lawsuits in the middle of this. So it is not sufficient just to say, oh, these are special circumstances and rules don't apply. So it applies to participant activities. It also relates to interactions with your vendors. And I'll close out on saying vendors, because everybody immediately jumps to it's all about the record keeper, but it's not. As we have this discussion today, it is, yes, your record keepers are key and essential, but it's also about your consultants, your advisors, your other service providers. Do you have an outside wellness vendor? Do you have other similar vendors? Because everybody who touches plan data at this point, there's a real concern about security. I have a story that I heard secondhand, and I'm not going to name any organization, that talked about an organization that outsourced part of their back office to outside the United States, and people have consented to that. Apparently, the people have been sent home, but not with work devices because they don't have portable devices, and the people are expected to log in from personal equipment. And this is a potential brand name company that people on this call use. It's important to ask the questions. How are you and your subcontractors doing things? And it's not just about the record keepers. It's about anybody who processes plan information. So that's my quick start off there, but I'll stop there. Wendy?
Thank you. Thank you, David. Brian, I wanted to kind of have you add to David's comments in terms of the security considerations with video conferencing. We're hearing a lot about that right now, and thought maybe you could comment.
Yeah, Dennis, I know that you've been closely involved with some of our conversations with our vendors. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that, Brian and Wendy. So I think the first and foremost, the question we always get asked is it safe to use video teleconferencing? Particularly with the providers that Brian talked about earlier. We say absolutely yes. You know, these services and service providers are generally quite secure if they are configured correctly, right? And I think that's where a lot of the noise is. So when you think about the considerations in video teleconferencing, I group them into three buckets. First is Zoom bombing, which everyone is very familiar with. It isn't unique to Zoom. There are other capabilities as well as the providers this could happen to. I think Zoom's getting a lot of negative media just because of the sheer growth of their platform. I mean, in the period of a few weeks, they've gone from 10 million plus users to well over 300 million. They're going through some growing pains, but it's not unique to them. The first and foremost things you can do with any sort of video teleconferencing capability is making sure that you're using a unique meeting ID and you're embedding a password within an ID. And you do not want to be posting that in social media. That's where a lot of the bombing and whatnot has come in. There are actually capabilities on the dark web that allow individuals, criminals, to actually surf and identify some of those meeting IDs. So you definitely want to be using non-unique IDs. You don't want to use your name or the same static ID. Use a generated ID with an embedded password, and talk to your IT folks and make sure they know how to do that. But that's pretty much a straightforward consideration. Secondly is privacy. And there are a lot of concerns. Well, wait a minute, I didn't authorize this. I'm not comfortable with this. Well, make sure when you're in a session that the recording is turned off, or you're willing to have your voice recorded. As you know, as a meeting organizer, you typically with all these tools have the ability to record or not. I would encourage you to disable it. It creates more privacy concerns than you need, and it's just safer for everyone involved not to record these meetings. They are generally, with all the providers, encrypted, particularly in the video side. But I wouldn't recommend that people, unless you have a need to, is actually to record them. So disable that. That's easily the simplest thing to do. And the third group are these really true security vulnerabilities. You've seen some talk in the media maybe about the lack of end-to-end encryption, or the fact that some of this code might be developed offshore, or maybe the calls themselves are routed through offshore data centers. And to a certain extent, some of that's true, some is not quite true. Most of the providers do provide end-to-end encryption on a video service, but no one can provide end-to-end encryption on a phone, because we're using technology that existed in the 19th century that's not easily encrypted end-to-end on a audio-only call. So be mindful of that. There's very little you can do with that. But a lot of the other infrastructure issues are very valid. They should be looked at, but there are things that the providers have done to address them. I would get familiar with them. And again, if you've configured your use of teleconferencing servicing appropriately, both from a security and a privacy perspective, you should be good. But you want to really cover off in those three areas.
Thank you, Dennis. And I know that your organization does a lot of work with clients large and small, but perhaps you could just comment briefly on the top three things you'd recommend small and medium-sized businesses do to protect themselves.
Yeah, that's a great timely question, Wendy. So first and foremost is really just to ensure the resiliency of the operation. And that really comes down to really understanding who your critical employees are, your critical functions are, your potential single points of failure. So going through your organizations, and I know, and even in an IT perspective, a lot of times we say certain functions may not be critical, or certain, business, accounting, and other functions. But what if you really were without that for a week? What if one person is not available, and heaven forbid they come down with it? What are you going to do? So the first and foremost is to ensure the resiliency of your organization by identifying your critical functions and ensuring you have contingency plans for those people. So if they're unavailable, if they come down, or maybe they have to just take care of a loved one, and they're unavailable for some time, what would you do? So that's job one. Secondly is, to a point Brian made earlier, is ensuring the ongoing confidentiality and integrity of your network by actually protecting yourself against what are becoming the most common threat vector that cyber criminals are using, which is phishing, particularly with using COVID-themed emails. So what we're seeing live is that the organizations traditionally have always done phishing are now using COVID themes for it. And really what's also starting to happen, which is really quite concerning, is those organizations that historically have been very active with ransomware are also using COVID and coronavirus themed emails as a potential hook. So you just, as an organization, you want to ensure awareness. This is real. It's happening across the financial spectrum. Most of my peer firms, according to the FSI reporting about an 80% increase in fraud, about a 50 or 60% increase in cyber-related activity. It's real. We're definitely seeing more activity, and you need to be prepared for that people are actively using this, to Brian's point of sending you an email hoping you're going to check out the latest update from the World Health Organization or the CDC, or maybe you really want to click on that Johns Hopkins University interactive map to find out where the rate of infection is. You just really avoid that temptation. Do not click on or really take, really open any email from a source you just do not trust or verify. So as an organization, you really need to ensure people are aware of that. This is real, and be hyper vigilant about that. So that's second. The second or third thing is really incorporating some of the things that Brian mentioned by putting in place policies and procedures, simple don't kill yourself over this, but make sure your employees know, how they can operate securely, that they understand that they should only be using corporate owned devices. And if you don't have them, if they have to use a personally owned device, when is that appropriate? How do you avoid the use of doing government or corporate business on a personally owned device? You want to ensure that, at very minimum, you don't want anyone ever to be doing any emailing using their personal email or on corporate or government-owned business. So there are a set of rules and recommendations that you want to make you just put out to your employees and let them know that these are acceptable practices, these are not, and some guidance about that. But I think employees generally want to know what's appropriate. I think organizations just need to help educate them.
Thank you, Dennis. And David, I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, I know that we're getting a lot of fast-paced changes being thrown at us, but what things are you most concerned about in terms of potential fraud that plan sponsors, might become victim of in terms of their retirement plan?
Sure, and let me sort of break it into a couple pieces. Let's start with the operations, and then we'll get to the participants point. As it relates to operations, we're seeing a quick adoption right now of, I'll call it, electronic services. As I said, it's not just record keepers, it's all service providers to retirement plans and plan sponsors, whether governmental or private plans, are saying, oh, you know what? I used to sign off on things on paper. I used to fax something. I need to do it electronically. I think from your own system standpoint, Brian and Dennis are both talking about security, whether it's VPNs and other items. It's essential to make sure that all your people who deal with this processing have very tight controls right now, whether it is sending data to your consultant, to your advisor, or to your record keeper. And it's because those are gaps, even if your record keeper has the best systems, that if your controls are weak, that's where you're seeing fraud, where people are going to try to pick off information. The phishing activities that could let someone into your network right now, those are all types of things that you need to be watching with on your own house before you start focusing on the other houses of people that you work with, number one. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of potential fraud on the participant level, I think some key things to keep in mind right now are as follows. First, right now, with your personnel and your headcount changing, if you are doing layoffs, furloughs, I think it is essential on communication to folks. There is no legal requirement. The plaintiff's lawyers might tell us otherwise, but there's no legal requirement to be sending reminders. And if you can do it electronically, obviously best in this day and age right now, to people about securing their access, doing their two-factor authentication if you have it available through your vendor, really locking down your passwords. I think it's essential to remind people right now, not required, but it is a positive item. I think for the governmental plans on the call, there's a very specific thing to keep in mind. Your population, especially if you may have a large population that has email at work, but you may also have certain services, whether it's sanitation, parks, some other part of your municipality that doesn't use email. It could be public safety, where you're not actually sitting in an office all day. A lot of those people don't always have email, and some of the early data breaches involved those folks where they didn't have accounts set up. And basically, because of public records that are often available for governmental entities, fraudulent accounts got set up. So it is important to really think about how have you communicated to your folks. Third is it relates to when you're rolling out a number of the CARES and other provisions at this point, the coronavirus distributions, the coronavirus loans, things like that. Now, starting as a baseline, those provisions pretty much mirror what you've seen for Hurricane Katrina forward every time Congress passes disaster relief, but this time it's getting a lot more attention. Why? Because it affects everybody. It's obvious and it makes sense. But what does that mean? Well, the pool is bigger for scammers at this point, not just in terms of people breaching data security against your participants when they give out their information or something like that, or get hacked on their computer. And there's a new lawsuit even on this that involves Abbott Labs that was just recently brought, where someone claims that they never got their notices through email, and it sounds like their email might have been hacked. But also think about what you are as the plan sponsor and plan fiduciary in working with your vendors. In the world we live in today, the world, it's evolved. 30 years ago, things were more expensive, but there was also, in a sense, a lot less of a transactional type of relationship now between a plan and its vendors. Now, as margins have been squeezed, your vendors work really hard to work with you as you do with them. You have to be good business partners. But at the same time, they're not responsible for everything. For instance, there's a lot of discussion about remote online notarization, electronic notarization, what is allowed. And it's evolving. Take Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico just yesterday changed its rules about what you need for Puerto Rico plans. But the thing to keep in mind is if you agree to changes and say, oh, we don't need this level of security now, in the end, when you sign off on these changes, your vendor is trying to do right by you, but a lot of it, if something goes wrong, does fall back on you as the plan sponsor or plan fiduciary. So I think a key recommendation is if when someone says, hey, we can relax this rule, asking the question, yes, we want to help our people, but is there a downside risk and how do we manage it? Do we want to say, okay, are we comfortable with this notarization process? Are we comfortable with large distributions? And you can't assume that your vendor can change its entire process. But a classic example is I have a client where they had a couple data breaches and they worked with their vendor to put in an extra step that if someone wanted to take out more than like $50,000 or $100,000, there was a validation back to the employer, just to say, we want to validate the address. Not everybody can handle that. Not everybody wants to do it. But these are things to keep in mind because as of right now, with people applying for unemployment, it's done online. People are moving more to online. People are posting things on Facebook and on LinkedIn. It is just a great way for someone to say, hey, this person just left their employer. They can see who they left, and it gives them a backdoor in. So that to me is a very practical takeaway. So to recap, watch your own house, figure out how your systems are, focus on more than just your record keeper, figure out what you've also been doing in terms of your approval processes to make sure there aren't gaps. And then for your employees, communication about reminding them is not a bad thing. And also looking carefully when someone says, I've got a simplification, to decide whether or not it's right for you. A lot of these are meant to be helpful, but in the end, you do hold the bag for some of these things. So I would keep that in mind.
Thank you, David. And I think what would be good to do right now is maybe to switch a little bit to focus on the benefits teams and those work-at-home employees that our plan sponsors are, concerned about and wanting to make sure everything's safe and secure. So with that, perhaps let's take the participants, the work-at-home employees first. And Brian, can you maybe comment on what you see some of the concerns and risks of that home environment being, especially when it comes to those personal devices like Alexa and so forth?
Yes, happy to, Wendy. I think, there's no doubt these smart digital assistants have made our lives a lot simpler, easier, more convenient. I think just from a privacy as well as from a security and confidentiality perspective, it's just important to know and be informed about what these devices do. So it's very common for these devices to be triggered by keywords. And so what happens typically is that there are small snippets of voice recordings that are triggered before and after these keywords are spoken. And not all technology is 100% accurate all of the time. So you might say, if, for example, if you have a daughter named Sarah, then that may be possibly mistaken for Siri, so on and so forth, right? Just so many possible avenues for potential error there. So because of that, it's really important, and we would certainly encourage folks to consider disabling and turning off those devices altogether, and or certainly at a minimum, just moving them out of their home office environment, right? Because if you're having that sensitive private industry or government conversation, you wouldn't want that small snippet of recording perhaps to be listened to by the manufacturer of that device, or perhaps even, some of those manufacturers may have third parties in undisclosed locations, right? And not undisclosed, but to you, the common consumer, right? You're not quite sure where those third-party personnel may be located. So there's certainly some risk there. So just from a privacy perspective, I think it's really important, you know, to maintain a secure private environment, and that goes above and beyond, you know, the whole theme and concept of going paperless, right? Certainly, I think paperless is so key, so important. Use some good quality headphones. Come into your private space where those conversations cannot be listened. But you got to be aware of not just human listeners, but these smart digital assistant listeners as well.
Thank you. David, I don't know if you want to comment on any particular things that you're seeing in terms of the concern and risks in the work environments. And then also perhaps you could comment on cyber-related fraud that might be occurring at financial institutions. It's kind of a double-pronged question, but wanted to throw that into your court.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the early things that we're seeing right now in the benefits environment that I think we're running into is historically a lot of people, especially if you're in an industrial company, you might have an HR person who checked ID or those types of items. And now you're getting phone calls. And in a bigger company, you don't know everyone. So I'm seeing more questions and reach out from people saying, what's my benefits? What am I entitled to? And more people coming out of the woodwork. I do think that it's important to obviously be responsive in these times, but it's very important for your benefits teams to really be thinking about what are your protocols for validation, even if you think you know someone. Because right now, when you're not in person a lot of the time, there's a lot more ways that people can basically emulate someone else, and it's important to keep that in mind. Similarly, as I think Brian and Dennis have already hit in their discussions, I think right now people have VPNs. The survey question was great, but there is still the issue that as people are working on these documents, people still probably, just like they were at work where you have industrial strength security usually, they may still be doing some internet browsing. Everybody flips and reads the news or takes a look at something, and it takes just one click at this point. So I think a little refresher on security protocols for benefits teams is not a bad idea, especially, and I know we're on a retirement webinar today, but especially when you're talking about healthcare and HIPAA type of things. If you have a person who crosses between both lines, I think it's essential to step carefully and be very, very safe on that. In terms of cyber fraud generally, it is definitely going to increase at this point. I already mentioned the Abbott Labs lawsuit, which predates the coronavirus situation. But there's a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands right now. And account logins and passwords, if we're going to move people to electronic communications, the Department of Labor now has sent to the Office of Management and Budget their e-delivery guidance, actually. So we're expecting that very soon now. The key thing to keep in mind is cyber fraud. People are definitely impersonating people as much as they can. People are getting the phone calls at home. We talked about that earlier. I think from a cyber fraud type of standpoint, it is a good time for you to also, dovetailing back to retirement, to go back to your vendors. And at this moment, I started off by mentioning this. I gave my story about the outsourcers sending people home. It's a good time to ask your vendors, what are your controls all the way down the line? They have their cybersecurity guarantees, but make sure things actually go down the line. Also, if you haven't done it, this is a really good time, because you still should be having your committee meetings and everything, to take a real evaluation and say, and ask your vendors, okay, what do you do for your security? How do you do the second level validation? I have heard of some vendors who basically want an address and last 4 digits of social, which, to be honest, is pretty easy to get at this point. And they're saying that's sufficient. I'm not calling anybody out, but these are the types of moments where it's good for you to ask, in order to prevent fraud, exactly what the controls are, and actually have that dialogue while I talked before. Cyber fraud is happening all over. Stimulus checks, everything like that is going on. But in our world, the key is making sure people do not get outreach that is fake or gives away their credentials. It's a lot of what we have before, but it's more important than ever.
Great, thank you, David. I wonder, Dennis, if you or Brian would like to comment on, some of the cyber-related fraud that you're seeing with your, in the defined contribution environment in particular.
Yeah, I can definitely take that, Wendy. So we're definitely, to David's point, seeing increased activity than we've seen before, and not all of it is COVID related, but there's a certain criminal element taking advantage of all the noise to try to slip in and do things, hoping that they might have been lost in all the noise. So we're just seeing a broadly across, and not just us, but I think a lot of our peer firms, again, over 80% of the financial institutions within the FSI-SAC, this global consortium of financial companies, report increased levels of fraud because the fraudsters recognize that these people are distracted. There's an opportunity to do that. There's some real good practical things that one can do to prevent that. David kind of touched on a couple, but I would say, again, first and foremost, think about, bad guys get into accounts by predominantly one of two ways. The first, the most common one, is what we call credential reuse or credential stuffing. So they're taking an existing password and reusing it to get into your account, because over 60% of people tend to use the same password for multiple accounts. So if nothing else you get from this webinar, stop that. Don't do that. You make sure you have a unique password for your retirement account and your brokerage account and your bank account. Do not use the same password, and not just your password, also your login. A lot of places default to using your email address as your login. Change that. Don't do that. Bad guys know that. They immediately will attempt to break into accounts that way. So create both a unique login and a unique password, if nothing else, for your 401k, your 403b, your retirement, your brokerage account. That will stop the majority of it. The second thing that bad guys love to do is do a password reset. So they go into your account and they say, okay, I forget my password, and they send you a challenge, right? Well, here's the trick. You want to make sure that you've actually implemented two-factor authentication on your accounts. So that challenge will come in the form of a one-time code, or it could be based on an application you have on your device, but you don't want it to be through a security question. David had mentioned this, but everyone, it's very easy to get any information about anyone today. Obviously, your social security number is no longer really confidential. Knowing what school you went to, what year you graduated, information about your spouse, your family address, your work, that's all commonly known. So, security question and answer is a very dangerous thing to do. So particularly for accounts that are sensitive, where you're storing all your financial assets, you want to ensure you've implemented a second form of authentication, which in general, for most of us, would be at a very minimum, you log in or you conduct some form of a high-risk transaction and you get a challenge. And that challenge is sent by a one-time passcode. Now, one nuance to that, again, to be very aware of, is that when you get sent that one-time passcode, generally any provider will do this, it's going to be sent to either your email or your phone, right? So think about really monitoring your email, your personal email, or whatever email you've given your providers to send a passcode to, because the favorite technique for the fraudsters is, before they attempt to compromise your retirement account, they first attempt to compromise your email account. And they're very good at it, because most of us don't think about applying two-factor to our personal email. We get way too much of it, so it kind of gets lost in there, but they love to go in there. So also be thinking about, do I apply two-factor to my Gmail, my Hotmail, whatever I might be using? If nothing else, just be monitoring that every day. Look at if you get a challenge sent to your personal account, like, wait a minute, I never logged in, you want to call your provider. The other thing that they love to do is send it to your phone. Same thing. It's actually, unfortunately, still not terribly difficult, depending on the carrier, to get your phone number actually transferred to another or forwarded to another device. Bad guys know that. They love to do this. So if you all of a sudden don't have access to your phone, isn't actually working as a cell phone, you're not receiving calls, that should alert you that your phone might have been ported or forwarded. And you may want to be very sensitive to that. So always just be very much aware that, the cyber criminal element to get into your retirement account is first going to often try to get to your email, your cell phone, so protect them appropriately, use two-factor, create a unique ID and password that's unique to those accounts. And if you do those things, I think you're really in good shape. One last thing I would also ask you to do is make sure that whoever your provider is, you've given them contact information, your email, text number, because we see all the time when we see something happen, we want to tell you in real time something happened. But if I don't have a phone number or I don't have an email or a way to reach you and I got to wait till snail mail, that's too late. So make sure that your 401k, your 403b, your brokerage account provider, they know your contact information, and also challenge them to make sure they have a process to alert you when things happen, because these days there's no excuse for providers not alerting you when these sort of sensitive things happen on your accounts.
And Dennis, to get a little wonky, it's David, but one question that comes to mind is, that's something with two-factor that I think most people are not aware of, that I think it's good to highlight, is that it's called SIM hijacking. It's not too hard to hijack someone's phone number at this point, but one thing employees should know is you can actually lock your SIM with extra passwords to your carrier. And if people are worried, it is something else to keep in mind, which there's still ways around it, but it makes it much harder for someone just to try and steal your numbers. That's something else to put on the agenda.
Yeah, no, it's great, David. And one other thing I would add to this mix is we rarely think about, we don't often think about it, is your actual talking with a phone rep. Because again, 50% of fraud will occur with a phone rep. I mean, that's typically how, if I were to compromise someone's cell phone, it's not that bad guys are typically locked going into your AT&T, your Sprint, your MCI account. No, they're calling a rep, impersonating you and getting them to forward you a number. So when you start thinking about that, also ask your provider, your record keeper, how do you authenticate me on the phone? We here at Fidelity, we use voice biometrics. It's becoming more common, but there should be ways to strongly authenticate you, because bad guys know that. If they can't get you online, they'll get you on voice. And again, a simple question and answer is not sufficient. Strongly recommend some form of a strong voice print form of authentication as well.
Sorry, Dennis, I'm going to keep bouncing. I just have to add this one item into this. People who have wellness services or outside third parties, those folks get a lot of data. It's important not to ask also what Fidelity has or any other record keeper has, but what they do to authenticate you, because that is another weak spot that you should be aware of. If you have student loan programs or anything, that's a great way for people to get data that then allows them to walk into your record keeper and have more validation points that allow them to get around your record keeper. So it's important to keep in mind, I keep hitting this, it's not just your record keeper.
Great, thank you. And Brian, before we jump to all these questions that have been coming in, I wanted to ask you if maybe you might be able to comment on some of the things you'd recommend for older parents, for example, as well as kids that are at home and protecting their cybersecurity.
I'm happy to, Wendy. I think first and foremost, just especially with all of us, or the large majority of us now being forced to work from home, I think it's, important, right? Many of us do have kids in the environment, and I think it's so important just to educate them. Going back to something David mentioned earlier, just about training, education, and awareness, right? Don't install software that's downloadable from the internet, particularly if it's oriented around social media and it's taking advantage of some form of emotion. Be very careful when you click, right? Curiosity kills the cat. Just teach your kids and teens how to hover over with their mouse any hyperlink, right? So they can see what that true URL is that they're going to visit, right? If it's an email that's coming from, FedEx, for example, and they hover over the link and it's www.hackingwebsite.com, right? Don't click on it. Not a good idea. And I think it's just so important to help our family members realize, especially our kids and teens, that no matter what you post online, it's there in perpetuity, right? It's going to be viewable years from now. Your future employers will absolutely, in all likelihood, do social media profile searches on you. So above and beyond the don't click, be very mindful of what you say or share. Certainly with older parents that are trying to help, I think that it's really important just that you educate them with a lot of these same principles and concepts, right? Don't click it. If you're not a big junk mail fan, right, and you don't spend hours of your day pouring through your junk mail, treat your digital junk mail the same way, right? Just toss it. If there's anything that looks suspect or off, if the email's asking for personally identifiable information, if the spelling, if the grammar aren't right, just don't click it. It's truly better to be safe than sorry. In this case, curiosity truly does kill the cat. So I think that's a good, strong principle to be aware of.
Great. Well, thank you. So we do have a variety of questions that have come in from the audience. So what I'd like to do is perhaps start with one that maybe I can take a quick crack at, which is how would you get a record keeper to adopt two-step authentication? And I think that what I'd like to do is comment there by, it is really important, as we've been talking through this presentation, to make sure that things are as secure as possible. And multi-factor authentication is one of those methods. Would one of the panelists like to, comment a little bit about the complexity of transitioning to multi-factor authentication and then also the benefits that it provides?
Wendy, this is Dennis. I guess I can take that. I think one of the key things in adopting two-factor is making sure that you have good contact information, because there are a couple of different ways you can do it. The simplest way is to do what they call a challenge, a one-time passcode challenge, which is pretty standard, where as people create, either log in or they do some sort of sensitive transaction, a unique 6-digit passcode is then delivered to them. It can be delivered to them in an app. It can be delivered to them, through an SMS or text. It can be delivered to them a phone call or an email. You can also use third-party applications, Google Authenticator, Auth. There are other types of applications that will do that as well. But I think for one-time passcode for providers like us, we need someplace to send it, and so it's really important that you have you've had one with your record keeper, that there's good exchange of that digital contact information. That was one of the challenges early on, that was some years ago for us now, but we need to make sure that we had ways to contact everyone. We always had name and address. We didn't always have good digital information, email, phone, cell phone. So I think that's really key to having that. But in terms of the technology, it's fairly standard today. It can take a few months to put in place, but there's no, it's such a commonly accepted best practice today. Technically, it's not a difficult thing to do. And there are options there are a couple of different ways you can go about it. But, I think I would say this is that if you're producing or involved in financial transactions, you absolutely should be doing this. I mean, in today's threat environment, it is almost inappropriate not to provide as an option, because the threat is so great. You can do it in different ways, but it's something that every bank or financial service company that does any sort of transaction should be able to provide you.
Yeah, Dennis, and Wendy, just very quickly, if I could piggyback on there, fraud has been proven to be reduced. Both we and our competitive peers in the industry have seen this, and it's also been, verified by third-party reputable firms such as Microsoft, to where two-factor authentication has been proven to reduce your fraud risk by up to 99+%. So if there's any one single measure if you're listening today, I would want you to take away from this, it's absolutely, for any and all accounts that offer two-factor authentication, be sure you take advantage of it.
Well, thank you for that good advice. And David, maybe what you could do is help me with this next question that came in, which is, as a plan fiduciary, what are the top 3 steps meaning the questioner, take to find gaps in our approach to cybersecurity?
Sure, and this goes way beyond the coronavirus. I think the top 3 steps, number 1, it is actually looking at your internal controls and access, number 1. Before you go outside, you start inside. You should do a real self-diagnostic as to who has access, Do you need to go on a data diet about who has what access to what information and slim it down? What are the controls and how do you manage that? Because no matter, you can have the best provider outside. If you don't, it's wasted. So you've got to start and look internally. And oftentimes internally is where the greatest challenge is. Number two, I think it's important to look beyond, I'll call it the marketing, whether it is a consultant, service provider, record keeper. Everybody has their glossies about how they protect you in the event about security, and they're great solutions. Put aside the glossy RFP presentation. Ask the real hard questions. Ask questions about their number of breaches, but don't be unrealistic. Everybody has had something go wrong, and to expect perfection is just not fair to anybody. But it's to say, okay, how many times have you had breaches? How many times have you made people whole if you have a guarantee? When have you not made people whole? Because inevitably, if you ask just for their security promise, you'll get a one-page PDF that's beautiful to look at. But it says, to the extent it wasn't your fault, we'll pay for it. That doesn't really answer the question of whose fault it is. So from a cybersecurity perspective, it's important to actually drill down with your vendors. You are not going to get every little nook and cranny, because that's what SOC 2 reports are. That's what other reports provide, a general overview. But your vendors should not be expected to tell you all the secret tools they've got, because if they do, it makes once you have it, they could become more insecure. But you do want to ask them, okay, if something goes wrong, who's on the hook? And you want to be clear about what's in your contracts. I spend a lot of time on this these days, on contracts, but also what do the guarantees say and what are the insurance? There's a lot of issues with limitations on liability. The last thing is as it relates to your participants, it's kind of a three-legged stool here. As it relates to participants, we've talked about a lot of steps to deal with here. I think that the first thing that you should do on cybersecurity is really, if you can do two-factor authentication, you should be figuring out how do you get it turned on, and you should be making sure that you've dealt in some ways with solutions that basically make sure that if people haven't set up an online account, a fraudster can't just go set it up for them because they missed the opportunity. I don't call this industry best practice. I try to avoid best practice, but I do think the idea of saying dummy accounts, especially in this time, is not a bad thing to think about. If you have a workforce that most people don't use email at work and you don't know how, and a lot of them don't have accounts, think about how do you enable them to get accounts in a verified way, but make sure that it's not just so easy for a bunch of them to be impersonated. That's the way major losses happen. Security guarantees don't get triggered, and insurance limitations get run out very, very quickly.
Great, thank you, David. And here's an interesting question, and I think maybe I'll try to answer it, and if anybody else has some other suggestions, let me know. How many plan sponsors have added cybersecurity to their quarterly defined contribution board or committee agendas? And I thought I would answer it by saying this has definitely been a discussion topic over the years, and it is starting to actually get a permanent place on the agenda, which I think is a recognition of how important cybersecurity is, not only for your participants' well-being, but also for fiduciary liability and avoiding headline risk. So I think there's something that this really needs to be talked about regularly. It's also important that board members and those, any employees that come and attend these meetings, if they do, to understand what cybersecurity really is and be educated on it. So there are a variety of board presentations that I present to clients, and I know other consultants do as well. So I think to make sure that that's a standing activity is really important. We also have access to training programs. So for example, table talk cybersecurity things. What should your employees be know about to be prepared for a cyber problem? So for example, asking the question, if I got into work and my computer was frozen, who do I call? sometimes it's as elemental as that. So training and education is critical. And I think looking at it from the organizational perspective and being sure you keep doing the housekeeping that's necessary is important. I'd also like to ask another question of individuals to, the panelists. And one of them is, maybe Dennis and Brian can start, and, David, you can keep everybody honest, which is, what's the current tip of the iceberg threat to DC plans? $1 million question.
So I can start with that. Let me go back to something you just said, Wendy, because I think it's just to affirm what you said. My team, we literally spent, I think we were involved in a few hundred such meetings last year with plan sponsor boards. I mean, it's becoming very common today where we get asked to come in as a rec keeper and present how we're protecting these plans and this data. I think all of us in this field are used to that, and we think that's a very common request. So, my recommendation would be to the people listening, don't hesitate to ask, your record keeper, who's ever your provider, to come in there, because we do it all the time, and we should have a good story for you. I'd say in this space, what the single biggest, if you will, the tip of the iceberg is really focusing more on cyber fraud. A lot of organizations have sufficiently matured their back offices. So while data breaches still occur, a lot of us over a number of years have invested so many dollars in that space. That's still a fairly unusual event. It does happen, but what's today happens every single day is participants have someone breaks into their account and attempts to move money out of those accounts. And as David is alluding to, if you're with a provider that doesn't guarantee those assets or doesn't sufficiently protect those assets, you might be dealt with a very real possibility. You have a participant who's out a few $100,000 and it's on you or whomever, right? That's the more common threat, because 3 or 4 years ago, we didn't see a lot of cyber-related fraud in retirement accounts, but that's changed. We always have seen in banking. We always saw it on the more traditional brokerage side, but definitely the criminal element has become much more aware of the retirement marketplace, 401ks, 403bs, et cetera, and has been actively targeting them in ways they haven't been before. So I think, ensuring that your provider has adequate controls to prevent cyber fraud, the actual theft of your retirement assets, I think to me is one of the most compelling situations in the cyber community today as applies to DC plans.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dennis. I think just 2 things to add very quick, technically speaking, and David, I appreciate your thoughts as well, but just technically speaking, right, we mentioned the importance of 2FA, two-factor authentication, for any and every account that provides it. The other one is just simple password hygiene, right? Get away from the complex passwords where you have to do 3 or 4 character types, 8 or more characters, change it every 90 days, right? Instead, opt for something that is what we now call a passphrase. It's a simple phrase that's easy to remember and is personable and meaningful to you. For example, I love weekends and spending time with my family, right? 5, 6 words, string them all together, no spaces in between. You've now got yourself a secure password. Also consider the use of secure password managers. They manage your passwords for you. There's a lot of very good, strong, reputable ones out there. They're for free. You can download them. Super easy, convenient way to manage your passwords.
And I happen to agree. I'll stop there and be the quiet lawyer for once.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your great responses to all these questions. I know we got a lot, and I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all of them on this call, but DCIIA, NAGDCA, and Spark will continue to have crisis-related webinars, and look out for more announcements and other additional resources linked at the end of this presentation. Lastly, thanks to the panelists and also for all of the attendees. Please take the survey that will pop up on your screen following the webinar. And we want to thank you all for attending, and I hope this was a valuable exercise, and stay safe out there. Thank you.